My name's Martyn Ware from Illustrious Company Limited in Britain. My speciality is three-dimensional soundscaping, and I'm here in Ludwigsburg to create a fantastic, immersive three-dimensional impression in sound of this beautiful city. I've always used D&B equipment since the very start. It's the best for me. It sounds like an advert. It's not meant to be. It really is perfect for what we do. It's very detailed. We've used it in all kinds of situations, from the Millennium Bridge in London to giant squares in Mexico City to Leicester Square, where there's loads, millions of people passing through all the time, to a giant shopping centre in Liverpool. And the key thing about all these things is the clarity and the detail is essential, because if you're creating this impression, it needs to sound as real as possible, and D&B equipment delivers that every time. I've spent 35 years writing music, electronic music, some orchestral music, soundtracks, and in the last 15 years, soundscapes in 3 dimensions. The key element to all this, it's a given that you know what you're doing and that actually the compositions sound good. Some of it's purely music. In this case, it's a mixture of sound recordings, effects recordings, atmosphers, Foley, literal speech narrative, and some composition. And it's like bringing everything to a big pot and creating a dish, that's the nearest analogy I can think of. But as I get more experience as a chef, the dishes taste better, and I think this one is going to be very tasty. Working with 3D sound has definitely changed my creative processes. I used to be particularly obsessive about mixing, and I would sometimes spend 2 or 3 days mixing say a pop track for Tina Turner or whatever. I'd be really ridiculously perfectionist. I mean, tiny amounts of changes. But then I realized when I started working in 3D sound that the beauty of this is that you can place sounds in midair, and you don't have to treat them so much to make them fit together. You can be much freer with your mixing techniques, even levels. It's more forgiving of that, because it's in space and everything's released from the box. And I now liken stereo mixing to 2 toothpaste tubes and squeezing the music through these tubes to your ears. It's really restricting mixing in stereo now. So what it's taught me is to be much freer after 35 years with mixing. And actually, when I go back to taking these 3D mixes and putting them into stereo, they all sound great. So what was I worrying about in the first place? That's what it's taught me. That really not to freak out so much about technical details, and it's really all about the image that you're building in people's minds. First of all, the great thing about 3D soundscaping is that it appeals to every single person, even dogs or animals. I have a great story, actually. I once did a soundscape with a blind artist, and she had a guide dog. And there was one part of the soundscape where a person walked up an imaginary staircase at the side of the room. And obviously we put the steps in the right place, in space. And the dog followed every step with its head like that. And at that point I knew it definitely worked, our system. So the thing is, we all listen to the world in 3D. We just don't think about it. That's how we determine whether something subconsciously is real, and also it's useful on an ancestral level, from avoiding being attacked by birds or something, or you need spatial awareness in the same way we think of the world in visual terms, but actually a lot of our spatial awareness is sound. In fact, try walking around the city with earmuffs on. It's quite difficult. So what we're doing is triggering a sense of hyperreality in sound. That is particularly suitable for recreating real scenes. If it was a stereo exhibition, however good the speakers are, it would not trigger that sense of reality. It becomes one step removed. This is, you are in the center of the experience. And that's the difference between what we do and even 5.1 in a cinema, for instance. I'm not a technical fetishist, so I'm more whatever gets the job done. So I only use a small portable recorder. We'll be using some recording of this kind of thing. But there aren't any particular technical requirements. I know how the sounds are going to be placed in 3 dimensions. So everything I record is based around, is it going to be useful to me or not? Now, some of it we'll throw away and only pick the very best bits. And actually, sometimes you have to throw entire sections away if they don't fit with the overall flow. There are no particular technical requirements. I mean, it's just standard recording techniques, really. There are certain things that, because of the experience I've had doing all these soundscapes, it's pretty unique, really. I don't know of any other company or person that does this sort of thing. In the same way, anyway. So, over 15 years, I've developed antennae that allow me to recognise the things that I know will work in a soundscape. And I'm always looking for things that are unique to the location that I'm in. That's the key to it all. If it's generic, it might work in terms of contextualising something that's unique. But there always has to be, in the DNA of it all, there always has to be something that really you had to be there. It's about that special experience. And so I'm not very happy if I have to fake something. I want everything to sound as authentic as possible, because the means by which we impart it to the audience is so realistic sounding that it exposes any fakery. So that's what I use as a kind of filtering mechanism for. I mean, I love sound anyway, and sometimes it can be a curse, you know, because I live in this world of listening carefully. I suppose they call it mindfulness now, sonic mindfulness, all the time, and sometimes it's very hard to switch it off. My friends at D&B invited me to create some content for the Ramvelten Pavilion at the Film College in Ludwigsburg. It's a temporary structure, inflatable structure, and they kindly donated some equipment to be placed in the space. It's quite a big space. And then they thought, oh my goodness, what we're going to play in there. So I've got, with Illustrious, my company, we've got a history of creating meaningful content for city-based spaces and imaginary spaces in 3 dimensions with our special technology, 3D audioscapes. So I said, yep, I've done several projects in the past based on cities, so like New York, Mexico City, London, various smaller towns, and it's a series called Soundlife. And in a nutshell, the idea is to examine what's unique in sound terms about a particular city or a town, and then condense it into a short 3-dimensional sound experience. So it's like the analogy is distillation of ideas into something more focused and more flavoursome. And of course, when you're doing it with something like London, you've got a giant amount of stuff to deal with. Ludwigsburg is 90,000 people or so. It's a different challenge because, in a way, it's more unique because there's nowhere like Ludwigsburg, whereas London is more like a big generic city. So I always try and look for the positive aspects of wherever we're going. And Ludwigsburg is unique in many ways, and that's what we're trying to capture in sound. The way that this process works is I look at a list of things that have worked previously in installations about cities or towns. And through experience, I've been doing this for 15 years, I know which things appeal to the public, which things are a bit obscure, and I can apply that template to any town now. So I have a list of maybe 20 different subjects that I try to cover to create a balanced view of a particular town. So it's about collecting a lot of stuff, and then I get to my studio, and I kind of filter it through my experience, reduce the amount of content by about 10. It's a bit like shooting a film. You have shooting ratios. I have sound shooting ratios. Probably, yeah, it's about 10 to 1, I would say. And bear in mind that in a three-dimensional experience, you can have many different elements flying around the space, overlapping each other. It's not like a radio play where it would sound too confusing. In space, if you want to pay attention to a particular sound, you can just visit it or pay attention to it in space. So I often have, for instance, we'll record all the bells that we can find in Ludwigsburg, and we'll have them all happening at the same time in correct geographical locations relative to the square. We'll have all the fairy tales maybe happening simultaneously in the space, overlapping with each other, and the sound of children running between them. So it's about picking subjects and creating an immersive narrative that's more like it's more impressionistic than a kind of linear narrative. It's more like building a film in your head, only using sound, but without having a literal narrative thread through it. You know, there's no kind of voiceover. It's not a documentary. It's meant to give you an impression in sound of the meaning of Ludwigsburg. All the recordings we're doing is I'm trying to distill the essence of Ludwigsburg in sound in 3 dimensions. So all the recordings we're doing are, we're not recording anything to throw away. Everything informs what we do, and I would like to get some small element of everything we've recorded into the composition. It might be something as simple as walking on a gravel path in the gardens, or just passing by the fountains, or it could be somebody speaking about Ludwigsburg. Some of it's historical, some of it's contemporary, and the trick is to create a balance between historical, contemporary, geographical, cultural, scientific, industry, and combine all these things. It's a challenge, but to combine all these things in a meaningful way that will make, hopefully, the people of Ludwigsburg feel very proud about their town. I'd be disappointed if people couldn't easily identify the different areas that we've been to. Maybe the brewery is a bit more tricky, but certainly they'll recognise the market square because of the bells of the church, and you know, the sound of the people talking about vegetables. And they will definitely recognise the sound of the church's interiors as well, for instance. And the different areas, I mean, today, for instance, we'll be going to a square where a lot of the students congregate, where in fact the pavilion for the festival will be placed. And that will be a kind of buzzy atmosphere, which will surround you when you're in the actual pavilion itself. It's quite weird. It's kind of importing the place itself inside into the place. So this, you know, the history of this stuff for me is about creating a theatrical experience in immersive terms, but only using sound. That's the challenge. So my challenge is for people to say, it's really for people from Ludwigsburg. They would recognise it. Outside, people will find it interesting. So I've got to balance that. But they won't go, oh, I know where that's from, Ludwigsburg, because they've never been. But I think I've done my job if people in Ludwigsburg go, that's amazing, I recognise all those sounds. That's what I'm trying to do. The Museum of Ludwigsburg is quite small but quite interesting. Gives you a bit of historical context about the characters and the formation of the city. Quite hard to put into sound, but great from a research point of view, so I can go back and search on the internet for all the famous people that have come from the town, including Sheila and various other people who, particularly poets and musicians from the Baroque era, and also some very interesting things about how the city developed and the industry. Very interested in the different inventions that were made, including Viagra and aspirin, particularly Viagra. And no, there were various kind of a diverse range of technologies, and that I think would be very interesting to include from a sound point of view in the story of Ludwigsburg. You can't tell the story of the town without referring to the historical past and the palace and the amazing parties that must have gone on there. So that's something I'm building an image of in my mind, which then I will try and interpret in sound. And really, I'm also very interested in looking at the not just the historical perspective, but the what it means to be growing up as a youth in Ludwigsburg, and what the future holds for Ludwigsburg. So it's not just preserved in aspect; it's hopefully a dynamic story that we're trying to tell as well. The marketplace, really, from a sound perspective, is fascinating. I'm very interested in why do people congregate in certain areas of cities. In previous soundscapes that I've done, marketplaces play quite a big part in it, because it's about survival, it's about food, it's about interconnection, it's about exchanging ideas. Usually they are surrounded by churches. In this case, there are two churches opposite each other, one Protestant, one Catholic, and we've got the beautiful sound of bells, which at first I thought was the two churches responding to each other. In fact, it was just a reflection of the same sound from the opposite side of the square. The sound of the market sellers selling their wares, and really it's the heartbeat of the city, and I try and capture that. So one small section of the soundscape in 3 dimensions will be a recreation of the market square, as though you were there. So if you were blindfolded, it would sound as though you were in the middle of the square. There are beautiful fountains, there are cafes, etc. And I think, that's the most animated part of the city, really, I think. And there were a lot of musicians playing there. Oh yeah, I've forgotten about that. Right? Yeah, there were some street musicians there. There was an oboe player, I think, and a accordion player, if I remember rightly. And I think we need to acknowledge that all these things animate a city or a town. And in Ludwigsburg, it's very important, I think, that it's a beautiful sunny day, so everybody's sat in the square and they feel good to be alive. It's not just a matter of, oh, good grief, I've got to go shopping. It's more of a social encounter space. The brewery is quite interesting. Walked around it, went into the cellars, saw the brewing process, met the brewers, who were very nice, and tasted the beer, which was the most important thing. But hopefully we can bring to life the whole brewing process using the different sound elements that we collected there, and also the ambience of this microbrewery and restaurant and bar. The Fairy Tale Park was it's probably my favourite thing that is indicative of Ludwigsburg. It's everybody grows up with fairy tales. The Grimm brothers' fairy tales were my favourites, and they seem to play a large part in the park. And the way that these animatronics and sound elements were knit together was very engaging, I thought, and occasionally terrifying for small children. But what a lovely thing, you know, instead of having to go to Disneyland or something, or have a kind of ersatz version of this, to actually have this in a free park for everybody to experience, and the mystery of these magical characters coming to life, I think would stay with children forever. And actually, as I was growing up, to see them come to life, even as an adult, you know, it's something. I mean, it's not big, clever, contemporary technology. It's old technology, but it's very beautiful for all that. And particularly from a sound perspective, I thought it was really exciting and interesting. And to hear the children responding to what was happening was also very exciting. Whilst being given a fantastic tour of the castle, which was visually stunning, as you know, you can see. From a sound perspective, there was some very interesting elements. The most interesting of which was in one of the main ballrooms. It was designed so that if you clap your hands, it actually sounded like birds fluttering away. And in fact, there's a mural on the ceiling of the birds. So that was fascinating. I was particularly fond of, I'm very interested in the history of theatre and the way we build impressions in people's minds, experiences. And to see the Theatre Museum and the theatre itself was amazing. And to, you know, hear the wind machine and the thunder machine was particularly great. And also to see the way that the castle administration, they engage children as well in the whole life of the castle, and I thought that was a particularly beautiful thing.